How will the Syrian government deal with its growing security challenges? Renewed fighting between the army and the Syrian Democratic Forces is highlighting the volatility facing the country. The truce is now in place, but will it lead to an agreement to integrate the SDF militia into the army? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. As this year is coming to an end, a deal between the Syrian government and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces had been expected to come into force. Instead, fighting erupted between the two sides in the northern city of Aleppo. They later agreed to stop the fighting while blaming each other for the violence. That deal was supposed to lead to the SDF integrating with the army, but it's now stalling on how that should be implemented. This renewed tension comes as Damascus is facing other threats, ranging from ISIL to recurrent conflicts with the Druze community and continuing attacks by Israel. So, what does this complex security situation mean for Syria 1 year after the fall of Bashar al Assad? We'll explore that with our guests. But first, this report from Michael Apple.
Tracer fire lights up the skies over Aleppo. Syria's second largest city has seen a flare-up in fighting between the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, and the Syrian army. Exchanges of heavy machine gun and mortar fire killed several civilians and injured many others, including civil defense crews.
We headed to the location of the bombing. We saw two little girls injured. I went with my colleagues to help them. We were shot by a sniper of the Syrian Democratic Forces. I was injured in my neck and my colleague was injured by fragments in his back.
While both sides have now agreed to de-escalate, many civilians fled during the night. Assurances of peace have been made here before. In early October, the US brokered a ceasefire between the SDF and government forces in Aleppo after tensions escalated between Kurdish-majority neighborhoods and government troops. The US-backed SDF controls significant parts of northeastern Syria, covering nearly a third of the region that's home to lucrative natural resources like oil, gas, and wheat. After the toppling of Bashar al Assad in December 2024, President Ahmed al-Shara took over a fractured country. In early March, Damascus sought to bridge one of those divides, signing an agreement with the SDF that it would merge into the Syrian army by the end of the year. But with that deadline only days away, Syria's foreign minister admits there's been little progress, if any.
During the past period, we didn't sense any initiative or any serious will from the Syrian Democratic Forces to implement this agreement.
His comments come as the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan visited Damascus to press for the dismantling of the SDF. Ankara views the armed group as the Syrian extension of the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, and considers it a terrorist organization. As efforts to rebuild Syria continue, the country finds itself at the crossroads of competing domestic and international pressures, with the threat of ethnic and sectarian tensions ever present. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Beirut is Heydemann, a researcher at Chatham House. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Stephen Heydemann, professor in Middle East Studies Program Director at Smith College. And from Ankara, Omer Özkizilcik, a non-resident fellow for the Syria Project in the Atlantic Council's Middle East Program. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for your time. Heydemann, what does this renewed fighting tell you about the state of affairs in Aleppo and where things might be headed to?
Well, unfortunately, this is not the first escalation between the SDF and official forces, government forces in Damascus. We have seen a similar escalation in October and other ones before that. And this shows that the ongoing negotiations have not been able to ease tension, and that a deal to bring peace into Syria is still far. Now, I think one of the major issues to keep an eye on is whether those sort of episodes of escalation will be able to be contained in the future, or one of them might trigger a wider conflict between the two forces.
Okay, Stephen, even though there is a truce that is now in place, you have said that clashes like these often signal pressure in stalled negotiations. So if this is signaling, who's trying to pressure whom?
Well, we're reaching a point at which the agreement that was signed between Damascus and the SDF back in March is about to expire. It expires at the end of this month, so very, very soon. And the question of what will happen once that agreement expires, I think, is putting both Damascus and the SDF under considerable pressure to make progress in the talks that have been going on in an on and off fashion all the way back to March, some 10 months now. And it seems to me that what we're seeing in these clashes is an effort by both sides to demonstrate that should negotiations fail, should they not make progress, that the military option remains open. And we've seen, I think, principally from Damascus, repeated comments, subtle comments, but repeated comments indicating that should negotiations fail to make progress, that the government, the interim government, might be forced, in its own words, to resort to the use of force to achieve the integration of Kurdish areas into Syria. But I think we have to be careful not to underestimate how much has been achieved in the talks already. There has been agreement on how to integrate Syrian forces. There has been agreement about constituting a joint force to combat ISIS between the government and the SDF. So on a number of areas, we have seen progress, but there remain significant differences that have to be overcome, and they should be overcome soon.
Okay, Omer, how is this being read inside Turkey's security establishment? I mean, are the latest clashes evidence to Turkey that the SDF could be failing to implement that March agreement, or proof perhaps that that deal was never really realistic to begin with?
I mean, from Ankar's perspective, it's quite frustrating, to be clear, because when the March 10 agreement was signed, the Turkish side was unhappy with the extensive time limit up until the end of the year. The Turkish government hoped for a much shorter period of implementation. But it was Damascus that convinced Ankara to wait up until the March 10 agreement is finalized and the deadline has been reached. And we also know that for Turkey, this has a different angle with the PKK's disarmament process that's also ongoing simultaneously. So from a Turkish perspective, the stalemate and the stalling in Syria is preventing Turkey from moving forward with the PKK disarmament process. So it blockades the entire new hope for the PKK's decision, after the PKK's decision to dissolve themselves. And the recent clashes, to be frank, are more of an indication rather than a clear sign that escalation is on the horizon. For Turkey, this has been going on for too long, and I expect that after the deadline has been reached, that we will see growing escalatory rhetoric and maybe even escalatory action from the Turkish side.
Well, that's the thing, Omer. I mean, Turkey, Ankara hasn't ruled out crossing the border to fight Kurdish forces. How real is that threat, do you think?
I mean, it's quite real, to be frank. I mean, a year ago, there was Russia to protect the SDF. The Russians are no longer there. A year ago, the Assad regime and Iran supported the SDF with weapons and logistics. They are no longer there to support them. The Americans have decreased their military presence from approximately 10 military bases to only 3 military bases in SDF areas. So this is a real potential. And from a Turkish perspective, it was a decision to reach out an olive branch and allow this integration process to happen as a goodwill gesture. And after this olive branch is not being taken, and will be received positively by the SDF, I expect that the Turkish side will step by step increase the rhetoric and escalation.
Hayed, why is it proving so difficult to integrate the SDF into the Syrian army?
Well, there are different reasons behind it. One of them is basically related to the question you asked, because many people are viewing this as only related to how the military and security forces will be integrated and merged with the new system in Syria. Now, for the SDF, the discussion goes way beyond that and goes towards basically the identity of the state that is emerging now in Syria, the political powers that will be distributed between the center and the local at the local level, and the constitution itself, what sort of authorities will be given to the president, to the different regions, as well as the governance system. Now, on all of those issues, although, as Stephen has mentioned, that there has been some progress, at least in some areas, because there has not been a comprehensive agreement that addresses all of those issues, each side has been quite skeptical about the willingness of the other party to continue to provide compromises and reach a common ground, and be on the ability to implement those at a later stage. And that's why even when we see small progress in one area, that is not being translated into implementation on the ground, and B, easing tension between the two, because the tension keeps increasing because of the deadline that everyone has been mentioning, which is basically the end of the year.
Right. And speaking of that deadline, Stephen, with that deadline fast approaching, clearly, at this point at least, it's not being met. So what happens next?
Well, look, I mean, as a Turkish colleague said to me recently, this is the Middle East. The agreement will be extended. We shouldn't necessarily view the expiration as a moment of collapse of negotiations or of the agreement itself. But I want to emphasize something that Heydemann said, because he highlighted the principal difference between the SDF and the interim government in Damascus in their approach to these negotiations. The SDF wants a comprehensive agreement. They're looking for a grand bargain that will respond to all of their concerns about representation in the government, about the constitution, about appointment to leadership positions in key ministries. The interim government is looking for a piece-by-piece, case-by-case agreement on specific components of the March agreement. And that's one of the main reasons why it has been so difficult to bring these talks to a successful conclusion. There has been movement on specific issues, but the SDF leaders continue to say that without a comprehensive agreement, it's not possible to finalize any of these specific details about point-by-point understanding of the March 10th agreement. And this is a big sticking point. And it reflects, I think, a very severe difference that will be difficult to bridge, but I hope that the parties can find a way to do so.
Can they do so without external influence or help? Who has leverage at this point over the Syrian government to address these issues, Stephen? And also, what leverage does the SDF have over Damascus at this stage?
Well, I think there are a number of actors in the region with significant influence over this process. One, of course, is the United States, through the Syria Special Envoy and Ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack, who has played an active role in trying to move these negotiations forward. And the U.S. has made clear its position that this is an agreement that needs to be resolved through negotiation, not through the use of force. The U.S. has cut back its presence in the Northeast, but it does retain troops there. And it would view the use of force to resolve these differences as a significant misstep, a dangerous misstep in the northeast of Syria. I also think we have to recognize Turkey's influence, which is perhaps more significant than the role of the U.S. It has been actively engaged with the interim government in Damascus. It has made clear its impatience about bringing these talks to an end. It has deployed incendiary rhetoric, as we've discussed, but thus far, and this was affirmed by the visit of the foreign minister of Turkey to Damascus just yesterday or the day before, that the Turkish government in Ankara so far is prepared to let negotiations continue. And that, I think, is an important signal as well.
Omer, but if Turkey does indeed intervene at some point down the line, what does that do to Syria's already fragile security situation?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't expect the Turkish military marching in as of 1st of January, obviously not. But that being said, if there's a military intervention, we would see actually how weak the SDF is and how fragile its so-called governance apparatus in northeast is. Because northeastern Syria is 80% Arab. The people there see the SDF as an occupying force. And the SDF basically is an entity that was hyped up by the American taxpayer, by American support. They have forced conscription, which increased their numbers. So they look much stronger and much more influential than they really are. And this is thanks to US policies since 2014. And just like the Afghan army collapsed when Americans withdrew, if the Americans would withdraw today, the SDF would collapse similarly. So therefore, the SDF has the potential to enforce its own vision on Syria. And this is something we have to understand. The political vision of the SDF for Syria is Syria decentralized and with territorial limitations. So they don't want the Syrian army to cross to the eastern side of the Euphrates River. They want decentralization and they want to maintain command and control over the SDF. So basically an autonomous zone, an army within an army, a region within a state. And this is unacceptable for Syrians. The vast majority of Syrians are clearly in support of the Syrian government. We have the Arab barometer and different polls clearly showing that. And the SDF doesn't have the popular base, just like the Assad regime didn't have. But the Assad regime controlled vast areas of Syria, and it collapsed very fastly. So if there's a military escalation, if there's a military intervention, the SDF will collapse very fast. And let's be clear, the negotiations did not stall because of disagreement over political vision primarily. The primary reason why it stalled is the Israeli intervention. When the Israelis bombed the presidential palace and the Ministry of Defense in Damascus, the SDF changed its attitude totally. From making concessions, like in negotiations, they were willing to hand over the entire governorate of Deir ez-Zor, including the oil fields. And after Israel intervened, they changed their attitude. They came to a maximalist position, and now they try to impose their own political vision on Syria against the will of the Syrians. But to be clear, the Syrians they don't want a minority to decide over the future of Syria.
Okay, let me bring in Hayed to respond to all these allegations and claims that Omer is making. I mean, do you agree, first of all, with the premise that the SDF doesn't have a popular base in Syria or in the areas it controls?
Well, it's difficult to examine or have a real sense of how much power they have there or popularity because unless you have direct access and you ask people, it'd be difficult to really assess that level of popularity. So it's easy for any outsider to claim whatever they want in this sense. I personally don't have any sense of what sort of popularity they have there. Now, the issue is it's not only related to how popular they are, because I think some of the issues they're raising resonate with other Kurdish groups, even if they are not basically totally in alignment with the SDF and the main political party there. Because of that, I think it will be difficult to differentiate between the fears that the Kurdish community might have in the area and the interests of the SDF and the SDC, who are now the de facto actors there. And because of that, for example, what we saw in Sueda, that initial fighting was triggered due to escalation between some armed groups there and the government, but then it quickly escalated into confrontation between different communities. You have tribes on the one hand, Arab tribes, and then you have many Druze civilians who picked up arms and start basically fighting because they saw the attack as threat to their own communities and their own life. And this is why I think it's difficult to imagine that the fighting, if it erupts, and hopefully it would not, to be limited to the armed groups that will be that basically.
So are you saying that these latest clashes then perhaps could raise the specter of violence in other parts of Syria and possibly sectarian violence?
If it leads to large scale and open confrontation, then possibly yes. Because what we have seen in the coastal areas led to escalation in the Druze community and led to the fears that I just mentioned earlier. And many people in northeast Syria now are fearing similar attacks on their communities there. So yeah, it's difficult to differentiate what happened before to what might happen later.
Stephen, how does this violence reflect on Ahmed al-Sharar's control of the country and on him as president 1 year on?
Well, this is also an important constraint on the possibility of escalation in the Northeast, because violence on the coast some months back in coastal areas in which large numbers of Alawi civilians were killed by government security forces and vigilantes, the violence in the south that Hyde referred to, these have all, I think, elevated the differences between the central government, the interim government, and minority communities. And it was these differences, it was the resort to violence on the part of the government and the unconstrained use of violence by irregular government forces that produced the shift in the position of the SDF earlier this year around its terms for integration, and made the imperative of some degree of self-control, some degree of delegation all the more important. I have to say, what we heard from Omar was a very effective presentation of the view of conditions on the ground from the perspective of Ankara, but I differ with it quite significantly, and I find it quite troubling to hear this kind of rhetoric that a military intervention in the Northeast would be a cakewalk because the SDF is a paper tiger. I think we have to recognize that military intervention would be profoundly destructive. It would undermine Ankara's goal of a stable, secure, integral Turkey. It would raise huge doubts about the stability of the al-Shara government and his future as Syria's leader. And so I think we have to recognize that Syrians are not entirely opposed to the idea of some form of local governance, that the idea of the Northeast having a measure of control over its own future is not something that would divide and fracture the Syrian state. And I would hope that there is a pathway toward bridging divides around how to organize decentralization that can be achieved without violence.
Okay, Omar, I'll give you a chance to respond, but keep it brief if you may. And also tell me what you think are the biggest challenges that Syria faces in the next 12 months as we wrap up the show here.
Yeah, I mean, about Northeast Syria, I have to repeat, we are not discussing the political future of the Kurdish areas. We are not there yet. The negotiations never could enter this aspect of the Syria's future. What we are discussing is the Kurdish-dominated SDF occupying and controlling majority Arab areas and not willing to hand them over, or not willing to integrate these areas into the Syrian state. So basically, they want to keep an area where the people are clearly Sunni Arab tribal. So this is quite different than what happened in the coastal areas and in Sueda. And I don't think that the SDF has changed its attitude due to the massacres and the human suffering and the war crimes that happened. But okay. I think that it was the change of balance of power. And here, let me say one more thing.
Just briefly.
Don't think that, I don't think that we will see a military escalation towards the Kurdish areas of northeastern Syria. I think everyone understands that the Kurds in the Kurdish areas of northeastern Syria have a right for local governance, but this is not where we are. We are discussing the future of the Arab areas in northeastern Syria.
Okay, you didn't answer my question on what you think the challenges are over the next 12 months. I'll just give you 15 seconds or so. Go ahead before I move on to my other guests.
For me, the biggest challenge Ahmed Shah is facing is the Israeli threat to divide Syria and to keep the Syrian government fragile and to prevent have Syria preserve its territorial integrity.
Okay, thank you. Haid, what do you think is the biggest challenge over the next year or so for Ahmed al-Sharaa?
I think the ability to reunite the country. We are talking now mostly about the SDF and the tension with the SDF, but we also have still one big region, which is Sueda, that remains outside the control of the government. We have seen demonstrations recently in coastal areas. So I think the ability to work on domestic issues and bring those groups back together and then being represented in the government will be the major challenge and the only way forward.
Okay, Stephen, what about you?
Well, from my perspective, I think achieving an integrated professional security sector is an enormous challenge for President al-Sharaa in the coming year. He continues to confront a deeply fractured security landscape, and that is a significant threat to the stability of the country over the coming 12 months.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining us. Haid, Stephen Heydemann, and Omer Uzkzilcek. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can always go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X as well. Our handle is AJ Inside Story from myself and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.